Good evening, and welcome to this Center for Brooklyn History talk. Tonight, we're focusing on the complicated, centuries-old relationship between America and Iran with expert John Ghazvinian, whose new book is titled America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the Present. Before introducing John and his conversation partner, Hooman Majd, let me briefly introduce myself and say a word about the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm Director of Programs at the Center, which was formerly the Brooklyn Historical Society and is now a part of the Brooklyn Public Library. In addition to stewarding the most extensive collection of Brooklyn history in the world, and in addition to our research and education activities, every week the Center for Brooklyn History offers free public programs like this one through BPL's programming arm, BPL Presents. In the next few weeks, CBH and BPL Presents will be hosting programs with Naomi Klein, Masha Gessen, Tashi Reagan, Roxanne Gay, and many, many others. I hope you'll go to the Brooklyn Public Library's website and find the BPL Presents page and explore what's coming up. I also want to share two important notes. First, we will put in the chat a link to purchase America and Iran locally at the community bookstore here in Brooklyn, and I encourage you all to buy a copy of this book. And second, I want to invite everyone to share your questions for John. Throughout the program, you simply type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome John Ghazvinian and Hooman Majd and tell you just a bit about each of them. John Ghazvinian was born in Iran and raised in London and Los Angeles. He has a doctorate in history from Oxford University. His writing has appeared in publications that include Newsweek, the Sunday Times, the New Statesman, Slate, and The Nation. He directs the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania and lives in Philadelphia. Hooman Majd is an Iranian-American writer and the author of 3 books on Iran, including the New York Times bestseller, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ. He has written for The New Yorker, GQ, Newsweek, the New York Times, The New Republic, Vanity Fair, and many other publications. He is a contributor to NBC News, and he lives in New York City. I want to welcome you both, and I want to thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction and to the introduction to the Center for Brooklyn History. Hello, John. Good to see you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me.
I'll start by saying you're wearing a jacket, I'm wearing a tie. Between us, we can kind of be somewhat like professional. So, and we're both wearing pants, I will say that.
You don't actually know that.
I don't know. I know I am. I assume you are too. Anyway, welcome with this terrific new book of yours. I think it's really, also very timely given the news cycle right now and the idea of Iran once again being in the forefront of international relations with the United States. Before we get into the book, which I really enjoyed reading because it kind of felt like a story to me, less like, just an academic tome where you have to kind of figure out what's going on. It felt like you're telling a story of this history of Iran and the United States, which we know from your book, certainly, and anyone who is paying attention, did not start in 1979 when there was an Islamic revolution. I think many people, including myself, and I used to think of myself as knowing things, did not know it went all the way back to 1722. I knew about the 19th century ambassadors who came to, Persian ambassadors who came to Washington. I did not know it went back as far as 1722. And the fascination with Persia as it was known then and the Persian Empire. But before I ask you some questions about the book, can you just tell us what made you write this book and what exactly is your background? I know you were born in Iran, you were educated in England, but could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I just want to take this opportunity also to say thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History for inviting me this evening. Thank you to everyone who's come to hear us chat. And also just to say what a great honor it is to be here with Hooman Majd as well. It's the first time I've actually sort of met, if we can call this meeting, face to face. but I've been reading your stuff for many, many years, and really enjoyed the Ayatollah Begs a long time ago when I was first starting out working on this book. And it's just, it's a real privilege actually to be sort of sharing the virtual stage with you, and looking forward to the conversation. So thank you.
My pleasure.
For doing this as well. Yeah, and by the way, I also really, it means a lot to hear that you feel that it read like a story, because that is something that's important to me. It's not always, I don't know whether I always succeed in doing this or not, but it's something that I always try to do in my writing. I'm a great believer in the idea that as historians, we have a special responsibility to tell a story. We are uniquely positioned, I think in many ways to be able to do that, because at the end of the day, that is what we do. I mean, that is the nature of our discipline. And if we aren't able to bring the human stories to life, then I'm not sure what we're doing. So I try to do that. I tried to write this book in a way that would be valuable to experts and scholars. I went to Iran 3 times to do archival research for this book, and I hope that I brought some fresh information to light that people didn't know about before. But I also really wanted it to be a book that you could give to your uncle or your aunt or your grandmother who loves to read history, and hopefully be an enjoyable story as well. So to answer your question, I mean, about sort of me and how I came to this, well, yeah, I was born in Iran. I was 1 year old when we moved to the UK. So I grew up outside London. And then in high school, we moved to Los Angeles, to Tehrangeles, where much to many people's surprise, probably, I don't think I had a single Iranian friend. I'm probably the only person in LA, Iranian or not, who never really hung out with a lot of Iranians. So it wasn't actually, in some weird ways, it wasn't a huge part of my upbringing. And I went to undergrad on the East Coast in Rhode Island, and then I went back to the UK for grad school, my master's and my PhD in England, and lived in London for a few years. So I bounced around a lot, as you have, not nearly as much as you have actually, but for a lot of my life, I actually studied British history as an undergraduate and did my PhD in early modern 16th, 17th century British history, although I wrote my dissertation on British travelers, including travelers to the Ottoman and Persian empires. So that's when the interest kind of began. I think like a lot of people of Middle Eastern heritage, I found after September 11th, 2001, that it was difficult to ignore the region. I think that being Iranian had, I wouldn't say it never meant anything to me, but it was not a big part of, it wasn't really what I was interested in pursuing intellectually or otherwise. But that began to change gradually over the last couple of decades. And my first book was a work of journalism. It was about Africa and African oil politics, but for the second book, I wanted to, I think, come to Iran in some way, and I wasn't sure exactly how. And I thought, I'm a historian, so what about the history of these two countries? And of course, it had been done before. James Bill had written an excellent history, and others had as well. And I thought, well, what can I bring that's a bit different? And I thought, well, a few things. One is that no one's really taken the story all the way back to the beginning. So that was kind of how this came about.
That's great, John. I mean, interesting. My background is similar to yours. I'm much older, sadly. I predate the revolution. I also was born in Iran and left when I was about 8 months old. Not by myself. My parents took me. My father was a diplomat during the Shah's time and moved around, went to American schools and boarding school in England, and then back to the States. And when I was growing up, Iran, my classmates didn't even know what Iran was. They didn't care. It was not in the news practically ever. Unless you were following foreign relations, Iran was not on anyone's radar. Some people had heard of the Persian Empire, but even in school, we studied the Greeks and the Romans. We didn't study the Persian Empire. It wasn't really very commonly known. After the revolution, suddenly, and I was in college at the time, suddenly everyone knew Iran in 1979, but hardly anyone knew that there was this long, long history of being allies, of being friends, of just a fascination on both sides. And you really get into this in the book. Can you tell me a little bit about the very beginning? Because I think this is going to be interesting to a lot of the people who are watching and who will read the book is, how did it start? Why did the US and Iran, which was, 8,000 miles away at a time before the US existed, when it was still colonies, how did this fascination begin?
Yeah, it's a part of the history that I think is absolutely fascinating, and that I could spend hours and hours going on about. But so the short version, one of the first things I noticed when I started reading other people's histories of U.S.-Iran relations is they all began, especially the ones written by American historians, they all began around 1940. And I understand why that is, because before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was basically an isolationist power, and Iran might as well have been Antarctica. It was on the other side of the world. There was no strategic U.S. interest in that part of the world. And so the feeling is, well, why study the relationship before that? I think that makes sense in a way, but I think it's also a kind of a problematic way to look at history, because what that basically is saying is that the history of U.S.-Iran relations only begins when the U.S. becomes interested. And I think what I realized in the process of doing the research for this book was just how much we miss when we do that. Just the fact that for 90 years, dating back to the 1850s, Iran was very interested in getting the U.S. more and more involved in its affairs. The U.S. wasn't really interested. But that's also an important part of the story. Just because Washington wasn't interested, that doesn't mean that there wasn't anything going on. The mere fact that Iran and successive Iranian governments wanted to develop a closer relationship with the United States in order to send a message to the British and Russian empires, which at the time were pressuring Iran and really interfering in its affairs and causing a lot of consternation among Iranians. And so Iran wanted to develop a so-called third force, a third alliance that it could kind of wave in the faces of Britain and Russia. And the United States was the country they kept turning to. Why? Well, this is where it's fascinating. They believed that the US, as a country that had had a revolution against the British Empire and against imperialism, would understand Iran's plight. The US seemed to be a country that didn't care about empire. And indeed, the fact it was almost like the more the U.S. ignored Iran, the more Iran liked the U.S. It was sort of, they admired the fact that the U.S. was very hands-off in its foreign policy, but they also admired the fact that the U.S. was progressing economically and militarily and politically in many ways. But they admired the fact that it didn't have an embassy in Tehran, that, the only Americans they knew were these missionaries, these Presbyterian missionaries who had come to Iran to build schools and clinics, and their government was uninterested and uninvolved. And that made the US very appealing. And the more they learned about America, the more they liked about it. That alone is kind of interesting. The very first disagreement that the US and Iran had with each other was in the 1850s. And this went on for several years. It was when they were trying to negotiate their first treaty of friendship. In 1851, they tried and they began negotiating, and they didn't actually come to an agreement until 1856. It was ratified in 1857. That took longer to negotiate than the nuclear deal, than the JCPOA. In the 1850s, you kind of think, well, what were the US and Iran arguing about in the 1850s? Well, get this, right? They were arguing about many things, but one of the real sticking points was that the Iranians wanted the US more involved in their affairs. And the U.S. was saying, no, we don't want to tell you what to do. We don't want to get involved in your business. Iran actually requested American warships. In the Persian Gulf, they requested the Stars and Stripes to fly from Iranian merchant shipping in the Persian Gulf to send a message to Britain. And the U.S., of course, they said, no entangling alliances. We don't want any part of this. That's the first disagreement these two countries ever had. And it's incredible looking back 170 years later to see that this is where relations began, with the U.S. saying, no, we don't want to get involved in your business, and Iran saying, no, please, we want you more involved in our business. We want an alliance with the United States. Now, that's the political element, and I'll stop here, but because, I wanted this book not to just be about politics. I mean, we could start with the beginning of diplomatic relations, but I think what makes the U.S. unique is that, unlike Britain, Russia, or many of the other European powers, its relationship with Iran goes back well before any political diplomatic relations, with Presbyterian missionaries, and also with a certain mentality, a certain cultural baggage that North Americans brought and that Iranians brought to this, which is kind of why I started in the 1720s.
Right, and there was this fascination with Persia. I mean, Persia sounds to Western ears so much prettier than Iran or Iran or Iran or whatever, however it gets pronounced. And particularly after the revolution, Iran is less interesting to many people in terms of being a fascinating place. It's the bearded men and the chador headscarf covered women. But there was this fascination. I mean, going back into the 1700s, where you start your book, the fascination with Persia. I mean, how did people even, I assume the educated ones, even know about Persia at that point? What had been the impetus for people to seek that out?
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I mean, this blew my mind when I was doing the research because I never expected to find this, right? Because it's true. What would someone in the 18th century North America, what would they even know about the Persian Empire? Where would they get their information?
Right.
So what really amazed me is I started looking at the first ever, and I could go on for a long, but I'll keep this relatively short. But you know, I started looking at the first newspapers published in North America, in Philadelphia and Boston in the 1720s. And this is before the US even existed. They were obsessed with Iran. 20 to 30% of the weekly newspapers were devoted to what was happening in Iran. They were, I mean, I even came across one newspaper where the headline said, "We regret that we have no news from Persia this week." I mean, that was the headline in Philadelphia, or maybe it was Boston, I forget, in 1720s. The leading news story was, we don't have any news from Iran this week. I mean, that, you didn't expect to find that going in. And the reasons for that are complex, and I could go on, but very, very briefly, I mean, Iran was the big international news story of its day. There was a big rebellion against the Safavid Persian Empire in 1722, the Afghans, the Mahmud Hotaki rebellion from the east, because the Persians were trying to force the Afghans to convert from Sunni to Shia Islam. Well, the Americans assumed that because of the Sunni Shia thing, the Ottomans must have been behind it. They must have been colluding with the Ottoman Empire. Which was, of course, the evil empire of its day. You know, the terrible Turk, the barbarous Turk, the Crusades, all this kind of stuff, all this baggage. And because the Persians and the Ottomans were rivals, the two great powers of the Muslim world, the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. These guys must be okay because they're rivals of these evil, hated Ottomans, these evil Turks. And the fact that they were Shia and therefore viewed by the majority Sunni world as somehow less Muslim and heretics made them even more appealing. They were seen as less Muslim somehow. I even came across a newspaper that described the rivalry between Ottomans and Persians as being a conflict between, quote, Muslims and Persians, which is such an interesting way of describing it, right?
The Saudis still say that.
Right, the kind of wishful thinking. So this was this idyllic, and then on top of that, there was the religious fact that Iran, that the Persian Empire wasn't in control of the religious sites of Jerusalem or any of these things. And on top of all of that, you talk about where did they get the information? Well, Puritans, especially in New England, these are Calvinists. They believe in the Bible as the ultimate true word of God, literal word of God. So if they want to know about the Middle East, they're going to open up the Bible. And when you open up the Bible, Iran looks really good because you have Cyrus liberating the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in Ezra book 1. You have the three Magi, the three wise men from the East. I always remind people, Magi is plural of Magus, which means Mog, or a Zoroastrian priest. They were probably Iranians, these three wise men from the East. So, Iran looks good in the Bible. And, it looks like the rival to Babylon and all the rest of it, which is the great evil force of the Babylonians, which the Ottomans are seen as kind of having inherited that. So for all these weird reasons, this is the mentality that Americans came into before they had any contact with Iran. The very first American missionary to go and settle in Iran 100 years later, Justin Perkins in 1834, the first word he used to describe what he saw around Urumiyeh and the Salmas plain, the word he used was Edenic. Right? Edenic. Literally, this was like the Garden of Eden. It was like a paradise because they actually believed that the Garden of Eden was somewhere around Mosul in northern Iraq, and that the Persian Empire began just slightly to the east of Eden, to the east of all these biblical sites, and was therefore not any kind of threat to Christian Europe or to their kind of ideology. So in so many ways, it seemed like this harmless, exotic Oriental kingdom, slightly to the east of all the Arabs and the Turks and the Muslims and these things that they hated, and it was less Muslim, less evil. I argue that mentality is still with us in the 1970s when you look at the way Americans talk about Iran. When they talk about the Shah and they talk about this as this kind of pro-American, kind of exotic kingdom and so on, that's just to the east of the sort of troublesome Arab world. It's amazing how much of that baggage stays with us. And the Iranians have their own version of it, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's and that's absolutely fascinating. The idea that a newspaper would have to apologize for not having news from Persia. I mean, today it would be we have to apologize for having too much news from Iran. But I mean, do you think there was a period? I mean, in terms of the American population, the general population. I'm not going back to 1722, but in general, over the last, let's say, 100 years, from the well, maybe even from World War II, let's say, from, as you pointed out. The general image of Iran has been, for Americans, has been like, oh, Iran's this great place, you just said, all the way into the 70s, this kind of interesting place, great carpets, interesting cats, good pistachios, and it's like kind of like lovely people, because we weren't here in America back then. We were over there. But there was a point at which Iranians started to view America differently. And my curiosity is here. In your research, did you find that Iranians started to see America as not quite the benevolent force it was in 1944 or in 1953? And we can get to 53 later, but in World War II, and I'll let you talk about it, how the US, along with Russia and Great Britain, now the three great powers were allied because of the war, came and deposed the Shah, the Shah at the time, in favor of his son, who was viewed to be more malleable. The Shah at the time was viewed to be pro-German and had, in fact, been sympathetic to the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, very loaded, very rich question. I feel like it's almost like 3 or 4 questions in one, but it is
yeah, 3 or 4. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. No, I mean, this is a great question. This idea of, was there ever a kind of golden age of U.S.-Iran relations? You know, I try to set up the book at the beginning by saying, look, you probably, if you're coming to this book, you probably know about 1979 and the hostage crisis and the Iranian Revolution and all that kind of stuff. Especially if you're American, and if you're coming, you know, and for Iranians, they have their own version of this original sin, this kind of 1953, the CIA-backed coup that overthrew a very popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and so on. I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows all of this history, but you know, a lot of people do, and so I didn't want to focus too much on that. I actually said, you know, what about, you know, a lot of times people, you know, especially Iranians will sort of, or especially anyone who's, let's put it this way, if you're critical of U.S. policy and you want to blame the U.S. more, you know, you'll mention 1953 as this kind of time when everything changed, when, you know, the U.S. overthrew a very popular government, and that's when that is when a lot of the resentment began against the U.S., particularly among educated middle classes in Iran, the very people that should have naturally been the most pro-American and were really up until 1953. But I think what's interesting, you know, I don't want to challenge any of that narrative, but I think what's interesting is actually, okay, so everything changed after 1953. So what did it look like before that? If you ask people who want to insist on 53 as the original sin, you know, there's this kind of assumption, this implicit feeling that, oh, everything was great up until the U.S. overthrew, you know, Mossadegh. And okay, well, tell me how, in what way, you know? And usually people can't do that. There's this kind of idea that, you know, things were better at one point, but what does that really look like? What was this? What were the 1940s, 1930s, 20s, 10s? Yeah, I think you could talk about that period as the closest thing we ever came to a kind of golden age of U.S.-Iran relations. In fact, Hossein Allah, a name that might be familiar to a certain generation of Iranians, probably very familiar in your family as well, I imagine. You know, one of these old, great elder statesmen of Iranian foreign policy, diplomacy, and so on, former prime minister, but also former ambassador to the U.S. He was ambassador to the U.S. in the early 1920s. And he was famous. He loved going around to all these towns in middle America. And the line he always used was, it's time for us to get beyond cats and carpets. So I was reminded of that when you were actually setting up your question about carpets and Persian cats and Persian carpets and pistachios and so on. Because that's the extent to which most Americans really understood Iran. And most Iranians before 1953, when they looked at the US, it was this kind of Wild West, exciting kind of cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers, John Wayne movies, you know, kind of this glamorous, you know, prosperous kind of place that seemed really benign in a lot of ways because it wasn't imperialistic and so on. And there was a lot of love for the kind of Wilsonian ideals of the 1920s as well. There were pro-American riots on the streets of Iran in 1919. I think that's something that really is, you know, something that's kind of extraordinary to think about today, just 100 years ago. So to be honest, I forgot your original question, but you know.
Yeah, the question basically, it was way too long of a question. I apologize for that. No, but the 50, we can get to the 53 post 53 period, which a lot of people are more aware of. But between 44 and 53, when you had this young Shah completely inexperienced. How old was he? He was like 20 years old or something. His father had just been sent into exile by these great powers. In that short period, I happen to know for a fact that only because of my own family's history, that America was still considered this great place, at least by the educated classes, the upper classes, the middle classes, whatever you want to call them. And people preferred to buy a Chevrolet if they could. They preferred to buy a Whirlpool, dishwasher if they could. But no, they didn't really use dishwashers, washing machines, or whatever it was that they did. Refrigerators, Sears catalog show up in Tehran. And you could even see, and I remember like visiting Iran in the late 60s actually, and the bowling alley on what was Pahlavi Avenue was like the hot place to go. And I actually remember seeing Reza Pahlavi, who's the Shah's son, at the bowling alley, surrounded by bodyguards one time. And he must have been like 10 years old or something in the late 60s, early 70s. But anyway, so there was this affection that Iranians still had for things American, for America itself. And obviously there was always dissent. There was dissent by the clerics and the religious classes, the very religious, who felt that the Shah was, too secular. I assume that went back into the 40s as well. But that was my original question. Sorry to make it long.
Yeah, no. And you've actually added even more interesting things to talk about now. But yeah, I mean, the 1940s is by itself a fascinating period in U.S.-Iran relations. Most Americans don't know this. U.S. was one of the three U.S. occupied Iran. I mean, it was one of the three occupying powers, along with the Soviet Union and Great Britain. And it was the first large-scale interaction between ordinary Iranians and ordinary Americans, because 30,000 U.S. GIs were stationed in Iran for the first time from 1943 to 45 as part of the Persian Gulf Command, getting supplies, lend-lease supplies from British positions in the Persian Gulf up to Soviet positions in the Caspian using the Trans-Iranian Railway. And this was, and there were many of them stationed in Iran. And my own father has told me many stories about kind of, used to call these guys Johnny as they walked by and whatever, these GIs, and how they used to, a lot of them would get drunk and go to brothels and so on. It was the first, it wasn't necessarily a very dignified introduction to Americans per se, but, so yeah, I mean, I think that's, there's a lot we could say about the kind of the war years. But I also like what you were saying about the 1960s, and, look, it happens gradually, and it happens, and there is a gradual disillusionment, and it's, you're right. I think the middle classes, the educated, the bourgeois, the sort of are probably the last to become fully disillusioned with the United States. I think it starts, to some extent with religious figures, but I think it starts more with the leftists, really, particularly from really noticeably in the 1960s. But as I say in the book, the United States finds itself in a very awkward position by the 1970s, because you have these three main threads of opposition to the Shah, right? The left, which is composed of all kinds of, as always, Marxists, socialists, Maoists, whatever. The sort of liberal Democrats, the sort of old Mossadegh people, and a kind of growing religious radical kind of, I don't want to say religious right, because I don't like putting things in left-right terms necessarily. It's not quite, doesn't quite fit. But what was ironic was that all three of these were very, very angry with the Shah by the 1970s, but all three of them, for their own different reasons, by the 1970s had different special reason for really being angry with the United States. And that was the potent mix, right? The sort of lethal cocktail that really exploded, which is that, on the left, of course, they didn't need a lot of reasons to, the hard left is going to hate the United States in the 1970s for its own reasons. It's just, for kind of obvious, reasons. Going to hate capitalism and all that, and the U.S. is the ultimate embodiment of all of those things. The religious figures, who for much of their history had been, it's funny, the left for much of its history had been kind of pro-Soviet and very institutional in the Tudeh and so on, and anti-American, yeah, but not in a really radical way. But it was this new generation of leftists by the 1970s, that sort of the Fadayin Khalq, Mujahideen Khalq, the Maoists and so on, that were much more radical. The same with the religious figures. They were very quietist and kind of pro-establishment figures up until the 1940s, 50s, 60s. But then by the 60s and Khomeini, they started to become more angry with the idea of kind of Western decadence and, the sort of anti-religious quality that the Shah's regime was taking on. And the US was the obvious kind of embodiment of that. And then in the middle, you had these liberal nationalists who under normal circumstances would have been the ones to kind of bring everyone together in the middle and say, hey, actually, no, America's not so bad. Let's work cooperatively with them. These are the people who would be naturally pro-Western, pro-American. But guess what? They were still nursing the grievance of 1953. The US had given them this, had taken their beloved hero, Mohammad Mossadegh, and overthrown him. And so they had their own reasons for hating the US, or to being disillusioned with the US, for believing that, we believe in liberal democracy, but where has it got us? We played by your rules. We played, but we had petitions and political parties and newspapers, and where did it get us? The world's greatest democracy overthrew our prime minister. So all three of these different groups, for very different reasons, were angry with the Shah and his increasingly repressive regime, but also with the US, which they perceived as giving its backing to the Shah. You can see looking back how none of this would have ended well, and of course it didn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's interesting is that during this period from the mid 60s, I'd say, when Khomeini was expelled from Iran, to the late 70s, we can't not talk about Savak and the repression as you had social freedoms explode in Iran, for minorities, for women, for just generally for people who, out in the big cities, certainly social freedoms exploded. And looking to the West, Iranians immediately looked to America. They wanted to come here to go to school. I remember in the early 70s when I first went to college, suddenly there was this influx of Iranians. There's maybe one other Iranian in the entire school, and suddenly there were 2,000. And so people wanted to come here to get educated, or to London, but mostly more to America. But while they were getting educated here, they were also being watched by Savak, for example, because I remember this very well. People would, in Iran, would recognize that I'm an Iranian, come up to me, say, come to a Confederation of Students meeting. And my father had always warned me, to stay away from those people because, Savak has infiltrated them and you'll be on a list and there'll be a problem for you. And since I had very little political ambition at the time, I was like, okay, fine, I don't need to be involved in this politics. But there was this absolute resentment of the Shah, both for the repression, but also for the fact that, and I remember people saying this to me at the time, but aren't you upset that the Shah takes orders from the American ambassador? And of course, I didn't know that the Shah took orders from him, nor do I know that he actually took orders, but he certainly publicly at least met with the American ambassador more than he would meet with anybody else, any other foreigner, let's say, on a regular basis. And there was very much this impression that the Shah was doing America's bidding, and that for people who had suddenly been exposed to the West, educated, had social freedoms, wanted more political freedoms, was anathema. And so, obviously that we can go through what brought about the actual revolution, but certainly the middle class was definitely disillusioned by the time with at least American politics and the American political system and its foreign policy toward Iran by the time of the revolution. And I should also add, I remember Iranian students, very much being involved, not involved, following the civil rights movement in the United States, being pro-civil rights, pro-protesters, following the Vietnam War. One guy told me once after the revolution, he said when he was a student still before the revolution and was protesting the Shah outside the White House, who had visited the Shah, and policemen were beating these Iranian protesters, and a black policeman, DC policeman, started hitting him with a baton, and he called out, brother, why are you hitting me? And the guy said, I'm not your brother. And he said, it's like the first time I realized maybe Americans don't understand us. Maybe we're not quite as well understood as we thought we were, that we are on the same side of the oppressed. So that's interesting. But what are your thoughts on that, on the repression, on the way that this middle class kind of stood by as this revolution happened, partly because I think they resented the way the Shah had governed.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny that as I listen to that story, Iranians, I think like many, I don't know if it's unique to Iranians, but I do think something Iranians do is have this kind of solipsistic worldview that, everything that somehow people are thinking about them more than they actually are. And I think there is that. You see that, this idea, you're right. I mean, the anti-Vietnam, anti-war movement during Vietnam very much influenced the Iranian left as it did the whole global left.
Mhm.
And, we see that, for example, when the hostage crisis took place in 1979. There's that famous moment, right, which we've all read about in all the different books, right, where, when the students stormed the embassy, they were carrying these signs that were saying, "We just want to sit in. We want to have a sit-in." Which, remember, this is 1979. That word now has really absorbed itself fully into kind of our vocabulary. But I mean, at the time, it was this kind of trendy new thing in kind of protest movements in the U.S., having a sit-in, right? And they were adopting that language, because they thought they had watched Kent State on television, and they really genuinely believed that by emulating kind of anti-Vietnam War protesters, that Americans would be sympathetic to them. And in fact, you read some of their memoirs, like Masoum Ebtekar's memoirs. I mean, they're really fascinating for this. When they started, having press conferences at the U.S. Embassy and, parading their hostages and stuff, they genuinely thought the American public was so angry with its government and with its war, the Vietnam War and everything, that they would just, they believed that the U.S. was full of young idealistic people who were all being beaten by police all the time. And, the Kent State was just what was happening in the U.S. all the time, or Chicago 1968, whatever, and therefore the American people who were just, it's kind of weird. There's a weird parallel to today, actually. But anyway, they believe that the American people were just, repressed by their regime and waiting to rise up against their evil leaders in the way that sometimes the American politicians think Iranians are today. And, and that somehow they would immediately identify. And once they took over the embassy and started saying, "Oh, we demand the return of the Shah," and all this kind of stuff, that Americans would just rally to their side. I mean, of course, this is insane. I mean, when you look back, with the perspective of history, the exact opposite happened. I mean, you take, dozens of Americans hostage like that, and no, that's not what you're not going to get the American public rallying to your side. It's going to be the complete opposite. But I think that does testify a lot.
Yeah, there was definitely a naivete on the part of the hostage takers, thinking that they're going to gain at least some support from the kind of people who today would be like Bernie Sanders supporters. That's who they were thinking was going to be like, "Oh yeah, right on. You're getting the CIA. You're giving it to the man," as it were. And going back to this idea that Iranians had, the middle class or college educated Iranians inside Iran had this idea of, and supported civil rights, and the idea of minority Americans being oppressed by their regime. As we know, also, as history can tell us, very shortly after the hostage crisis, all the Black employees of the embassy and military were released. They did not spend the 1.5 years in 444 days in the embassy under in prison conditions. But anyway, we are getting very close to the time when I should be taking some questions, because I'm seeing questions roll in. So I'm going to start by saying the first question is, what were you expecting to discover when you started this book, and how did that change? How did your opinion change?
You may not believe me when I say this, but I didn't go into this really expecting anything in particular, other than to sort of understand the deep history of U.S. Iran relations any better than I did.
I guess the question really is, what surprised you most? I mean, we did talk about some of the surprises that you had going back to 1722, but is there one thing that stands out, Iran-U.S. relations over the last 300 years?
Yeah, I think overall, I think the big surprise for me was to discover just how warm and affectionate this relationship was for just how long it was that way. When you look at the 200 or even 300, if you're looking at kind of deeper preconceived notions, history of this 300-year, kind of history, the last 40 years starts to feel like a blip. It doesn't characterize what this relationship has been like for the overwhelming majority of its history. I mean, there was this great mutual admiration, fascination, and even a mutual idealization, which is kind of what I was getting at before, dating back to the 18th and in Iran's case, the 19th century. And I think that, overall, that was the big surprise, was just how positively these people looked at one another. I mean, you look at, it's one of the things that pops out, the New England Primer was this book that generations of American school children learned how to read using this, right? It was the ABCs, the alphabet, from around the 1680s up until the 1920s. So for over more than 200 years. this was the main way you learned your ABCs. And it was a bunch of rhymes, little rhymes that illustrated the Bible and things like that. Like the letter A was, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. It was that kind of stuff. Next to letter B, it was, this book, thy I don't know, I forget. Like this book, you have to read this book. And there was the Bible. The B was for the Bible. And you get to the letter X, and it's not a xylophone, which is how all of us learned the letter X, right? It's the only word I think any of us can think of these days that starts with X. But it was Xerxes the Great did die, and so must you and I, right? Generations of American school children learned the letter X by learning the word Xerxes, right? This ancient Persian emperor. The name Xerxes rolled comfortably off the tongues of American school children, for centuries. That deep awareness and interest of a certain kind of idea about the Persians it disappeared at a certain point. But it was there right up until the 1950s, I would argue.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think one thing we should say, and you who've been to Iran in conducting research for this book, and all the journalists, American journalists, Western journalists, Iranian journalists, anybody that you ask, to this day, if you ask an Iranian on the streets of Tehran or any Iranian citizen, what do you think of the American people, not the American regime? It will be overwhelmingly positive. That I found in my own research for the books and traveling, and in conversations with fellow journalists and authors, to be one of the things that actually amazes most Americans do end up being able to visit Iran, and all these tours that go on, the people sign up for tours to Iran say, wow, the Iranian people are so friendly. And I mean, it is interesting that that's something that the revolution didn't change. Even among the most hardline people. I mean, you had President Ahmadinejad, saying he loves the American people, and I think for most Americans, Ahmadinejad was like kind of possibly the worst representative of Persian hospitality. But so anyway, I think it's a good point to bring up that I don't think has changed. Unfortunately, I think on the American side, there's this idea that the Iranian people are represented by the people who aren't very subtle in the way they try to say that they don't like the American government or American foreign policy by, for example, burning American flags, stomping on the American flag, saying death to America, things like that. It's like, oh, well, they must hate us all. They must hate us. And that's been an unfortunate thing. I'm going to go to a couple more questions because we're running very quickly out of time, unfortunately. We could talk for hours about your book. I got one question that says, I've heard there's a lot of corruption in Iran. True. Was that something that always existed no matter who was in charge? Can you illuminate on that? Corruption is something that comes up, all the time with third world or developing countries. So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, very much so. And it is one of these things that I think it's something that's always with us, and it's corruption. It's a relative concept. Yes, I mean, there is plenty of corruption in Iran today. There was under the previous regime as well. I think it's got worse in recent years. And this is a very loaded question, because I think the answer to this depends on how you feel about the Islamic Republic. I think its most vociferous critics like to really focus on the corruption that has got worse in recent years, and it has, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to kind of critique. I do think there's another point of view that does say that when you absolutely throttle an economy the way that the United States has in recent years with the kinds of really extreme sanctions, I don't want to say that justifies or explains, or somehow necessarily leads to corruption. But it tends to make things worse. I mean, it's just natural. People need to find ways around the sanctions, and then that's when sort of shady operators start to come in, but it's certainly an issue, it's been an issue. And yeah, I think it's not one that I'm particularly qualified to speak on. So maybe I'll just keep my answer short on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good answer. I think corruption is somehow related to the pressure, which isn't entirely the US's fault. It's also Iran has done things that haven't been helpful in terms of, and I think many Iranians would agree, inside and outside of Iran, in terms of the relationship. Under the Trump administration, things got particularly bad. I don't think Trump himself necessarily had any idea of what he wanted from Iran other than to make a deal that Obama didn't. But moving forward from that, though, I mean, human rights is another issue that people have a huge problem with Iran, and rightfully so. But I get another question which says, with this retelling of history of the people, how do you think it might change the way Americans and Iranians think about the possibilities for our future relationship? Especially now, I think that's a valid question with a new administration in America that has promised to change its approach to Iran in terms of the issues that it has with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that people will take away from this book a certain awareness of the fact that it doesn't need to be this way. You know, for the most of the history, it hasn't been this way. You know, maybe I'm naive. People have accused me of being naive and idealistic about all of this, and that's fine. That's an accusation I'm more than happy to accept, because I really do believe that the fundamental logic of 200, 300 years hasn't really changed. You know, that Iranians and Americans can easily see each other in this sort of idealized way again. Look, I don't think that tomorrow, that, you know, we're going to suddenly wake up tomorrow and find that the U.S. and Iran have become friends and allies again. That's not going to happen. But I do believe that, you know, the possibility is there. Obviously, the politics is complex, and you know, the other allies in the region also have a lot to say about this. You know, but I suppose embedded in that question is also a curiosity about where we are right now with the Biden administration. I'll just address that because that's always one of the first questions I get as well. Is, you know, where are things going? I mean, look, it's tough, okay, because obviously, you know, the bad news is that, you know, Iran has an election coming up in June, and you know, the Iranian president is term limited to 2 terms, 2 4-year terms, just like the American president. Probably we're going to see a more hardline anti-American administration. Just logically, I mean, after the pullout from the JCPOA, nobody's going to win an election in Iran right now campaigning on a platform of better relations with the United States. The hardliners and, you know, anti-American elements in Iran are very successfully making the argument. But you see, you cannot trust the United States. You know, I mean, President Rouhani and his reform-minded foreign minister Javad Zarif have been humiliated by this. This was their signature foreign policy achievement, the JCPOA in 2015, and since the U.S. pullout, it's just become very easy for their opponents to say, "Look, you see, you know, you guys were suckered, and you know, you can never trust America." So there's a very high likelihood that, but you know, for that same reason, this is also in some ways the good news, right? I think that Rouhani and Zarif are going to be very keen to try to resurrect the JCPOA if they can. Their legacy is on the line. They also want to take that argument away from the hardliners when it comes to election time, to be able to say, no, we can do this. Trump was just an aberration, whatever. But time is very limited. The presidential campaign in Iran is going to kick off pretty soon, like in March, April. And, you know, we're only dealing with a few weeks of maneuver. On the other side, the Biden administration, also a lot of the people in this administration worked personally on the JCPOA, and they also have an investment in the idea of trying to see if they can resurrect it. So I think there's goodwill on both sides. I think these people have actually, in many cases, these people have worked together and they know the details of the nuclear issue very well. But, you know, of course, Joe Biden also has a few other things on his plate as well.
Yeah. No, well, in the case of the nuclear negotiators and the Biden team, they have each other's cell phone numbers, which is helpful, and emails and everything else. I think it is. Well, I can go to another question because I don't want to get to it. We don't have a hell of a lot of time. A former Peace Corps volunteer in Iran says that there were many volunteer organizations in Iran in the 60s and 70s, and I remember that. Did your research uncover any interesting facts about them and about their work in Iran?
I didn't look closely at the Peace Corps' history in Iran, although I have contributed an essay to a new volume that's coming out that's edited by Matt Shannon, and I'm embarrassingly suddenly forgetting the name of the scholar, but there is an article in Jasmine Rustam Talai, I think is her name. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. She's, I think, writing an article about the Peace Corps in Iran. So I look forward to that. It's just not an area that I've looked at very closely, but yes, I mean, a lot of the people I've spoken to, people like John Limbert, Jim Good, and others, you know, these are people who have studied Iran and U.S. Iran relations for many years, but who also started out as Peace Corps volunteers. I mean, there's still an active community, as I understand it, of kind of alumni of the U.S. Peace Corps in Iran.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll leave it at that because it's not an area.
Sure.
I don't know.
Going back to the nuclear deal and the idea of trust, and again, this goes back to the history of the U.S. and Iranian people. I think the trust is not just on this nuclear deal that got abandoned by the Trump administration and subsequently imposing these sanctions, and which has damaged the economy. It damaged the economy for ordinary Iranians, not just for the government. The trust also goes all the way back to '53. We trusted America to not interfere in our democratic process. They overthrew Mossadegh, our hero. We trusted that they would be on our side in human rights issues, and not training the Savak, and not having the CIA and Mossad come in and train the Savak into these torture techniques and all that. We lost the trust there. We didn't trust them after the revolution because they'd sided with Saddam Hussein in his war, gave him chemical weapons. The Germans gave him chemical weapons, and nobody ever helped Iran in that war, which had been imposed on Iran. So this trusting goes on and on and on from 1953. And as you point out, now it's particularly bad because, okay, now, so the Iranian currency has been devalued. There are, shortages of medicine in Iran. People are in the middle of coronavirus, are dying. So this trust issue has become, it's a very, very important point. Not that the onus is necessarily only on America, because America also doesn't trust Iran, and Iran has done things that America views as not being trustworthy. But go back to the questions. I'm going to look at couple more before we sign off. One question says, the Iranian people may have been mostly friendly towards the U.S., but I would assume that an authoritarian regime can't survive without at least some support. Who are the supporters of this particular 42-year-old regime in Iran? And did you get into that at all?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I touch on that a bit in the epilogue to the book. And I know this is a bit of a minefield of a question, right? This idea of support for the Islamic Republic, because oftentimes, unfortunately, this is a product of what I think is our frankly broken discourse about Iran in the United States, which is that if you even suggest that the Islamic Republic has any support whatsoever, people will just lose their minds. And yeah. I already can feel, my Twitter probably blowing up with people, yelling at me, before I even open my mouth on this subject. So I want to tread carefully. There are many, many Iranians that are deeply dissatisfied with the Islamic Republic. Many of them live abroad, but not all of them. Many, you go to Iran, you will hear a lot of dissatisfaction.
Especially now.
Right, especially now. And I happen to believe that most of that is of the kind of bread and butter variety, about just, livelihoods and, what do we do? What are these, we're having trouble making ends meet and so on. And of course, because of the sanctions, that's only become worse. In my experience, when I've gone to Iran, those kind of taxi cab conversations with various friends, family, whatever, people, just anyone that will talk to you. It's a real range like there is anywhere else, but you don't hear a huge, this is where one of the biggest misconceptions I think that people have in the US about Iran. You don't hear a huge constituency of people who will say, who want to do away with the entire system, who want to have another revolution, who want, who are opposed to the whole idea of an Islamic Republic, and want to bring I'm going to get such grief for this already, but who want to bring Reza Pahlavi back from and all the rest. You don't really hear that in huge numbers. You don't. I'm sorry. You do hear a lot of disgruntlement and dissatisfaction, about the price of fish, the price of bread, but you hear a range of views, and you do even hear sometimes people who are very supportive. And I think that is the constituency that we tend not to hear from or hear about very often in Western media coverage. How do you explain that? I think there's a mix of things. Obviously, there is a repressive regime apparatus. Of course, there is a police state of sorts, and it's not like people can kind of go out and protest against the regime in hundreds of thousands, although they have occasionally. But it's not the only explanation. I'm sorry, and people may not like this answer, but if that were the only explanation, if it was simply repression that was keeping the regime in power, it wouldn't have remained in power this long. And that's something that is maybe difficult for many people to accept. It's not something I particularly like to, doesn't make me happy, but it's a reality. And as a historian, I think we have to try to understand that a little bit. When you have a group of people who have remained, I don't have any special affection for the Islamic Republic, but when you have people who have remained in power for over 40 years, despite having the largest the world's largest superpower against them, trying to undermine them at every turn. No real allies on the world stage. A lot of opposition, and somehow have managed to survive. It's not just because they're these kind of crazy, fanatical people who live in caves and wear turbans, and does the Islamic Republic have a kind of ideological bent to it that may be distasteful to us here in the West? Yes, absolutely. But they're also smart, savvy political operators who also know how to give the public just enough to keep themselves in power.
Yeah, there's also, I think there's also people who benefit from the continuation of the Islamic Republic. I mean, people know about the IRGC and the sheer numbers of Basij, for example, the militia, the IRGC militia, domestic militia. So, I mean, there are people who benefit from it. There are people who are socially conservative, are religiously conservative, who believe in their Ayatollahs, their clerics, what they say, and I have no idea if it's a majority, a minority, how many people it is, but they do exist, as you point out. You can't.
Right, and there are people who are religiously and socially conservative who don't believe in the Islamic Republic. I mean, Iran is full of surprises, right?
There's a lot of contradictions.
Yeah, you will meet people in Iran that you would think would be diehard supporters of the regime, deeply religious, deeply conservative, deeply even anti-American, anti-Western in a lot of ways. But then you start talking to them about it, they say, these people have defiled and spoiled religion. Religion has no place in politics. These people, religion is such a special thing to me that I don't want to see it enter into the political arena. People surprise you in all kinds of ways. Iran has a rich and complex political
very complex,
like any other country, and I think it's important for people to understand.
I mean, even some of the supporters of the Islamic Republic as an Islamic Republic, I had a conversation with a cleric in Qom, which is kind of the religious center of Iran, and he was a cleric, and he said he disagreed. I mean, he obviously believed in the Islamic Republic, not obviously, but he believed in the Islam, but he disagreed with making religion compulsory. He said they are, when he said they, he meant the government. They are, or the regime, they are going to make people move away from Islam by forcing them, by ramming it down their throats. And I've heard that many times, and I think that actually among certain people in Iran, that's a common refrain, even as you point out, among religious figures in Iran.
And I think there's real evidence that is exactly what's happened, actually.
Yeah. I have time for one more question, which is very relevant to today's news. Someone asks, what would be a quick confidence-building measure? Can you comment on the selection of Rob Malley as Biden's Iran envoy?
So as a historian,
confidence building, I assume from the U.S. side is what this person is asking.
Yeah, look, as a historian, I'm not very comfortable with these kinds of policy questions. Honestly, I'm much more comfortable in the past than I am even in the present, much less the future. So I don't want to be giving prescriptive advice, policy advice to the Biden administration. I mean, there are much smarter people who can do that. Confidence building. I mean, look, the sanctions are the biggest thing for Iran. I mean, they're desperately, like yesterday, need some sanctions relief. Mm-hmm. So anything that moves in that direction, even if it's not repealing all the sanctions, it's just starting, showing some goodwill, I think, could go a long way. Here's what I would say. As a historian, I'll go back to the 1850s and that first disagreement that the two countries ever had. I know it seems crazy, because obviously it's not the 1850s. It's not like suddenly we can just go back. I'm not naive. We can go back. But in some ways, what if we channeled something of that? What if we reminded ourselves of the first disagreement these two countries ever had? The disagreement in which Iran is trying to get U.S. protection against Russia and Britain, and the U.S. is saying, no, we don't want to get involved in your affairs. Today, Iran is facing this kind of unexpected, weird kind of pact of convenience between Israel and some of the Gulf Arab states and Saudi Arabia de facto and so on, whose implicit intention is to isolate Iran. In many ways, very similar to what they were facing. When they were facing the Russian and British pressure in the 1850s, they turned to the U.S. as a protector. Wow, what would happen if Iran pulled a rabbit out of its hat tomorrow and could actually say, we have this great we have a budding friendship with the United States, and waved that in the faces of the Israelis and the Saudis? That'd be the one thing no one would expect from Iran, right? Because the Islamic Republic is so geared towards anti-Americanism. But what if they did that? And conversely, what if the U.S. pulled the rabbit out of its hat and actually said something really genuinely abandoned all these ideas about regime change and interference in Iranian affairs, and really respected the Islamic Republic, and said, you know, we're going to deal with Iran as it is, as we find it, rather than how we would like it to be, and we're not going to interfere, you know, because the greatest rhetorical weapon that the Islamic Republic has in its rhetoric is that they accuse the U.S. of being imperialistic and arrogant in the region, and the U.S. makes that very easy for Iran. But what if they took away that weapon? Now, I'm not naive in saying that either of these things is going to happen, but what if both countries for a moment tried to remember and channel the first disagreement they ever had, and maybe absorb something of its spirit, you know, as they approach their conversations with each other. It's only been 170 years, and as a historian, I don't think that's a very long time. So I feel like, you know, that's maybe my advice as a historian. It's going to be ignored, I know, but you know.
That's great, John. I think learning from history is always good, or at least looking back at history and trying to see what worked and what didn't work is always going to be good. I think we're going to have to end.
I can see that there are a lot of questions. I just want to say, if anyone wants to, I'm easily found on Instagram and Twitter if you want to follow up and ask questions and so on and so forth, because I know we've run out of time.
Yeah, and I apologize for not getting to more questions. It seems like we ran out of time very quickly. As usual, I have to thank you, John, for this fascinating conversation, and actually for a wonderful book that I really, really, truly enjoyed reading. It's, you know, I hate to use cliches, but it is a page turner if you have any interest in American-Iranian relations and history. And it's told in this wonderful storytelling way. You don't have to be an academic to read this. You can, you know, your kids can read it. I also want to thank the Center for Brooklyn History and Marcia as well, and the Brooklyn Library. And with that, go buy this book. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you again to everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you all for joining. Good night.
Good night.